Let's talk a little bit about how science is different from pseudoscience, and sort of sometimes these things are equated when they shouldn't be. So science is when we're using the scientific method. So it is an epistemology. And that basically just means it's this branch of philosophy that investigates the origin, the nature, methods, and limits of human knowledge. So this is basically how we gain knowledge. It's based on objective, empirical investigation. So we're gaining knowledge this way. It is objective, meaning that we try to leave our biases aside. It's empirical, meaning we're following the scientific method. And we also, it's very transparent. So in any true scientific research, you tell your readers exactly what you did, your procedures, your methods, your data collection, how you got your sample, your analyses, everything is laid out for anybody reading it. So nothing is like, oh, we'll just trust us. Anytime you see something, kind of left out and it's like, oh, don't worry about it. That's a red flag. Any real science is completely transparent. And I mean, part of the reason is because you want people to know exactly what you did, but it also allows for replication. So if somebody wants to, test out what your findings with a different sample, let's say, or in a different area, or, 40 years after you did it to see if it still holds, like those kinds of things. If you are transparent as a researcher about everything that you did, then people can do it again and see if it still holds up. And then there's also, in true science, there's a peer review process. And this is where other people in the field basically go through your research with fine-tooth comb to make sure that you are actually, doing everything the way you're supposed to do it and that you have followed all the right rules, etc. So that peer review process makes sure that new research coming in has gone through that process and that it's rigorous. So that's real science. Now compare that to pseudoscience. Pseudoscience, pseudo meaning fake, is basically where findings are based on, somebody's just, oh, this is kind of what I feel like, or, it's my gut reaction to this, or, well, this is what happened to me. So that's like a true thing that happens to everybody, which, as we know from our errors in everyday reasoning, our everyday errors in reasoning, that's overgeneralization. So pseudoscience has a lot of those errors that we talked about in the last video. And so pseudoscience would be things like, for example, phrenology. And for those of you that don't know what phrenology is, that is a now debunked science that the shape of your skull sort of was indicative of what your behavior would be, or people used to think that, you could tell if somebody was more likely to be a criminal if they had, bumps or divots in certain areas. Like, I don't know the specifics, but it basically had to do with, like, they thought that where your brain was either larger or smaller or whatever, then that would affect what your skull was shaped like, and so then you could tell based on the shape of a skull. So we know that that's crap now, so that's an example of pseudoscience, which basically it came about because people used erroneous methods and, cherry-picked information and, looked at only criminals and then said, oh, well, we found this in all the criminals, so this means you're a criminal, even though they didn't look at non-criminals to see if they had the same thing, etc. So that's an example of a pseudoscience. Also, anytime, you're online and you see these, lose weight by taking this magical pill, and then you see in the subtext, oh, well, really, you have to, proper diet and exercise along with it, which obviously is what's actually going to be doing anything. But you'll see, testimonials, which are just, somebody saying, well, I did this and this is what happened to me, so that's what's going to happen to you. That's pseudoscience. That is not having that valid scientific method. And, saying that, oh, well, this happened to me, so that proves the effectiveness. That's not proof. So that's pseudoscience. So when somebody is conducting criminological research in particular, there are three kind of main motivations for doing, what you're going to do and why you're going to do that. And so the first one is policy motivations. So policy motivations are basically where somebody ends up choosing what research they want to do because they want to, improve something, better address some kind of problem that society is facing. So we could assess programs and policies that are currently in place and see where they're doing well, where they're not doing well, and then basically figuring out ways to better address the problems in society. So that would be a policy motivation. So we want to, we want to reduce a certain crime that's suddenly on the rise, or, this program is not reducing recidivism. We need something else. Things like that. Those would be policy motivations. Academic motivations are then where you basically want to learn more about something, and it's kind of the purest form of conducting research. It's where truly just to learn. And so you want to better understand crime, and then you want to better understand how society responds to it. And it's really just about that we don't know enough about this area, we want to learn more. And then there are personal motivations, which it's about like improving society, but it comes from some kind of personal interest. So some researchers start because they were a victim of a certain crime, or somebody that they know, or somebody that was close to them was a victim of a specific type of crime. And so then that sort of drives them to try to solve that problem, or somebody that they know, what the criminal justice system did not treat them well, so they want to try to figure out how we can better address issues within the criminal justice system, let's say. Now, of course, there is often overlap between these motivations. So, and sometimes there's even elements of all three. So, this is important to me because it happened to, somebody close to me, but I also just want to learn more about why it happened in the first place, but we also need better policies to address it. And so it could have all three of those elements, but it could just be purely one of the three. It could be an overlap between any two, but these are kind of the main reasons that people decide to do the research that they do. So when we're looking at research in practice, there are kind of like four major types of research that you can do, and sort of, four umbrellas that different types of research can fall under. And so the first is descriptive. Descriptive research is literally just about defining or describing something. It's like, counting how many things are happening, or looking at how big a problem is, really just looking to say, well, how many of a certain type of crime is happening, or how many victims are re-victimized, or what's the proportion of youth in the area who end up in the criminal justice system. So it's about just describing a problem. So a good example, what is the rate of sexual assault in Canada? If you were trying to answer that question, that would be descriptive research. Then we have exploratory research, this is sort of where we don't know a lot about a certain area, and so you're just gathering more information on something that we just don't have a lot of knowledge about yet. Maybe because it's something new, or something has suddenly come up that changed things around from what we thought. So a good example is, well, how do victims respond following an assault? So this would be an exploratory question, because it doesn't mean we don't know anything necessarily about that question, but it's sort of, we're just going to explore, we're going to see what victims say. We're going to just address this issue from an exploratory perspective and just sort of get some information before we delve a little bit deeper in trying to explain it a little bit more clearly. Which brings us to the next type, which is explanatory. Explanatory is often what we're aiming for in the long run. So sometimes we can't do it right away. Sometimes you have to answer questions about being descriptive or exploratory before you then can move to the explanatory phase. This is often where we want to end up as researchers, though. So it's about cause and effect. So we want to explain something. So what factors increase the use of violence by sex offenders? So this would be explaining why there's more violence in some crimes than others. And the reason for that is probably, you could have the purely academic motivation about wanting to know, but probably it's because you want to reduce the really violent sex crimes. And so that would be a type of secondary prevention where it's about harm reduction. So if these crimes are going to happen, how can we make them less violent? And so people don't get hurt as much, or, rapes aren't completed as much, or whatever you're specifically addressing. So explanatory is about trying to figure out that cause and effect. And we're going to talk about causality at some point in the future, but that's often what we really want to get to at some point. And then you have evaluation research, which is kind of, if you're not going the explanatory route, you might go the evaluation route instead. And this is more of a, if you have a policy motivation specifically related to like treatment programs or something to reduce recidivism. So it's basically the effects of intervention. So it could be about, for at-risk youth, it could be people who have already committed crimes and are in the criminal justice system. It could be for trying to increase assistance. But an example being, do relapse prevention programs in prisons work? So we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of them. We're going to design this whole study to see if the people who are getting these relapse prevention programs are recidivating less, the same, or maybe even more than people who are not receiving them. And we would make a comparison and see if they're actually doing what we think they're doing. So evaluation research is really critical for a lot of programs about, reducing the likelihood of recidivism. That's often where they're used. But it could also be in sort of at-risk, let's stop these people from going to becoming criminals in the future. So there are some good things and bad things about social science research in general. So studies are often designed to reduce common errors in everyday reasoning. So we know that that's a good thing. We want to make sure that we are not making those errors when we're doing research. But research always has limitations and flaws. You can never conduct a single research study that's not going to have some kind of limitation or flaw. It's just impossible because there is no such thing as a perfect research study, no matter how well designed it is. There's sometimes differing interpretations of things, so this can kind of make it difficult, especially if you're trying to compare across different research studies looking at a similar phenomena. And so it's if people are interpreting even, the variable slightly differently, or questions in a survey slightly differently, or, how you interpret level of violence, or like anything, interpretations are going to, even if you really, really lay out exactly what you mean by your variables and describe your variables, it can still be interpreted a little bit differently. Or even your final conclusions can be interpreted differently by one person to the next. So that's one of those things where you can your job as a researcher is to lay it out as clearly as you can, but there's always going to be those differing interpretations. And then, of course, there's also the idea that we're talking about people. This is social science research. So people are never totally predictable. It's not like, you're looking at things in a petri dish that, this is going to happen at this rate, and we know this is going to happen next, and we know this factor is going to have this effect. It's not like that when you're talking with people. We can talk about, patterns, and we can talk about, what increases or decreases the likelihood of something. That's all great, but we can never 100% predict, if somebody's going to recidivate or not. They may be the most high risk, but if they were out in the world, they wouldn't recidivate. And maybe somebody who's predicted to be super low risk actually would go out and recidivate. So we can never totally predict anything, but we basically do our best. And every method has its own limitations. So social science research in general is always going to have limitations, but also whichever method is chosen, each method has its own limitations as well. And I really like this little penguin picture that says, limitations until you spread your wings, you'll have no idea how far you can walk. And so the last thing I want to talk about is just the types of research methods. And so the experimental approach is one of the ones that's kind of most commonly used, especially if you want to talk about cause and effect. But to have a true experiment, you need 3 elements. So you have to have 2 or more groups, because there's going to have to be a comparison made. And then this is the toughest one, is you want random assignment to those groups. So you don't want there to be any difference between the groups going in to the experiment, because if one group is already, say, more motivated to change, or they're already doing better or something for whatever reason, that's going to throw off your experiment. So you want it to be totally random as to who is in what group. And then you want the assessment of change in the outcome variable to happen after the treatment or policy or program, which just means you're evaluating the effect of your treatment or policy after you implement it, which if you're not doing that, what's the point of doing the research in the first place? So those are the 3. If you have all those 3 things, then it's a true experiment. Otherwise, it's a quasi-experiment, which is typically missing the random assignment. So the quasi-experiment is going to lack one of those elements. Typically, it's because you can't do random assignment. So other types of research methods, there's surveys or questionnaires where you're asking fixed format questions. There's participant observation where you're just, people watching, basically observing and taking notes on what people are doing. And there are various ways you could do that, either covertly or as part of the group, or where they don't even know you're watching. So there's different ways you can do observation. And then there's intensive interviewing, so like where you're sitting across from somebody asking in-depth questions about their feelings, experiences, their perceptions. So it's more in-depth than a survey or questionnaire. Crime mapping is pretty cool, where you're plotting crime on a map. And then there's also secondary data analysis. There's lots of different types of this where you're looking at data that already exists. And so a content analysis is a good example of this, where you're studying some kind of media representation or legal documents or something that already exists, and you're analyzing that.